You may say to yourself, in fact, I'm familiar with what's the opposite of harmony. As the world currently is experiencing unprecedented level of chaos. What was mentioned? Conflict of self-interest, desires, needs, antagonism in terms of the different labels of our identity, different interpretation of the vision and the priority of humanity now. Not to mention political polarization, tribalism, right-wing tendency, and so on. So why harmony? Shouldn't we be fighting corruption? Shouldn't we be fighting extremism? Shouldn't we be fighting in social injustice and so on? Shouldn't we be launching a campaign against the climate crisis? Yes, we can see the world as it is and ask why. But here, as the song was inviting us to do, we can also dream of a world where it should be. And I say, why not? So why not harmony? It sounds a good idea, doesn't it? Whether we understand it or not. Okay, it sounds a good idea, at least according to three traditions. Let me just refer to them. The first is the Greek tradition. Harmony is a cosmic order, perfect form, excellent structure. Harmony can hold tension, including those opposites, virtues and vices. Harmony invites goodness, beauty, justice. And the Greeks even said that harmony invites love, as was repeated this morning. Because harmony bonds us all in an integral whole. Let's draw another source. That is a classic Confucian tradition. In slightly contrast, Confucian tradition seemed to say, well, in fact, harmony is more like a verb. It's harmonizing. It's a dynamic process where all the different things come together into a flow. We are familiar with the ancient Chinese symbol of yin and yang. So they hold in that totality. So each of the different elements within that whole do not lose its distinctness, but at the same time, it be part of it. And in fact, harmony requires the difference, the diversity. And then there's also modern version. Part of the inspiration of this forum's theme was the Prince Wales, the UK, his book on the principles of harmony. So he's saying that, in fact, harmony underpins our life. Just look at things in nature and how things should be. And that's the harmony with all that is. So these things, isn't that harmony sounds good? Doesn't harmony sound a good idea? But you may say, oh, okay, it sounds a good idea, but it's so abstract. It's so abstract that I can't feel it. Let's take it to something more practical. Do you know what jazz is? What Alta tried to jazz us a little bit. But I didn't. I didn't know what jazz is until 2 years ago, because I learned to play the piano by looking at notes in front of me. And without those notes, I couldn't make a sound on the piano. So the first time I was in a jazz club 2 years ago in Budapest, I learned that there was a British flautist, there was an Austrian saxophonist. There was someone from Lebanon who played the drums, and so on. Everybody come from different places, and they have different instruments. And I was wondering, they've never met, but how will they play music together? Probably this is nothing new for you, but I was amazed. I was amazed how they could do this. They were playing jazz standard, so they start somewhere over the rainbow, but then they took off. They invite each other as players, but also the audience, into an uncharted landscape, musical landscape. The different sounds, unexpected sound, the kind of absurd chord progression, refreshing melody, all that's been co-created on the spot, there and then. And the audience was part of the co-creation, as we'd experienced earlier on. And in co-creating the music, each one of us experienced the music in its totality. And that experience contains everyone. So, does that give us an idea what harmony could be? And how did we harmonize? What is in this extraordinary, in this jazz improvisation, is that different musicians, their different instrument, the various musical part, and diverse audience constitute the wholeness of harmonizing in multiple spheres. There's a physical sphere, the temporal sphere, but there's also cultural, aesthetic, and even the spiritual dimension. So strangely, jazz improvisation is almost captured by those three traditions that we talk about, who we interpreted harmony in the beginning, combined. That is to say that harmonization, harmony, is almost various of things coming together and responding to each other in a mutually promoting, mutually complementing, mutually enlivening way. So a harmonious world is a diverse world where no one and no voice is privileged, and where everyone contributes to that harmony and totality in equally significant way. That says so much about today, the world of difference. So can we also go into that harmonization process or jazz improvisation process a little deeper? What they do? What did they do? Some of the things we heard this morning, they were dialoguing. They were in a spiritual dance. They move with each other. And I was just talking to Olen just now, and he says, when you dance, you don't separate it as I or you, but we dance as a we. And so they're really embracing each other's realities, both inner, but also the musical reality. In the sense that product is the process. So the experience is that process, is inseparable. So in some ways, the jazz metaphor offers us a glimpse of what harmony could be. But the next question is, how does the harmonization work? For instance, Sister Janti talked about the harmony within ourselves. And the Prime Minister talked about harmony with each other, within our communities. Of course, there's another level, harmony within our institutions, harmony amongst the nations, and so forth. And most importantly is being repeated this morning, harmony with nature, and also with the sacred, human spirit. So these and the other questions that you started with will be part of the purpose of the forum. That is, we are here for a collective unfolding inquiry. And the structure of the forum is a reflection of that intention of inquiry. We have plenary sessions, which we're going to have first in a minute, where some learned voices will share their experience of harmony or harmonization. But there are also workshops where you actually experience how we contribute to harmony. And most importantly, each day we were going to sit together, have contemplative dialogue, and take these questions to even greater depth. And that is to say that each of us, all of you, every single one of you, each of us is both a contributor but also a participant of this inquiry. And that is also to say the depth and the profundity of the forum's experience hinges on all of us as we. And perhaps that just by doing that, by engaging in the forum's process, by participating in those workshops, listening and talking, at the end of the day, we have understood harmony not just because we heard someone said it, not just because you talked to someone about it, not just because you experienced it, but also in the midst of all this, in this inquiry, we participate in each other's inner and outer realities. And in doing so, we experience this ever-transcending but also ever-ascending human experience together. So the success of the program is up to us. And now I'm going to move. So that was the outline of the forum that Johanna has asked me to share with you. With that, we're going to start with the first panel. And the first panel, we're going to look at the big picture question. It sounds really big, but it's actually much more grounded. That is the harmony and the sustaining peace. And with me are three great presenters. So we have Bob Boisture, who's CEO and president of the Fetzer Institute. Please, Bob. And we have Pia, who has so many titles, I have to remember it. She's the director of Institute of International Affairs, and she's also director of 3 centers, the HÖFÐI Reykjavík Center for Peace, and Center for Small State Studies, yes, and Center for Arctic Studies. And thirdly, we have Professor Kenneth Gergen, who's the CEO and president of Taos Institute, another of those global institutes. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, sustaining peace, I just put this into a very brief context in case you're not familiar with. Sustaining peace is a UN aspiration. It encourages grassroots actions, institutional responsibilities, international collaboration, and connects healing, conflict transformation, and peace within an ecological and a spiritual agenda. So for the first time, humanity actually has a way of attending to our collective well-being in this holistic way. Now with us, the 3 speakers, what we'll do is I'm going to invite each of you to share a little bit your personal journey and also your perspective on this sustaining peace agenda. And each of you will start with 10 minutes, and then we jazz and flow and see how it goes. Would that be okay?
Sounds great.
Please, Bob, there's a microphone in front of you.
Good morning. I've got to start with a big word of gratitude. I think one of the discussion questions this morning was, what do you bring to this meeting? And I think probably that's the most powerful sense I have coming, is just tremendous gratitude, first off, to the founders who had the vision for this forum, and for our wonderful Icelandic hosts, and then for all of you all for feeling the call that brought you here. Then the question, what do you want to take away? And I think the biggest thing I want to take away is friendships and community. So big gratitude to the planning team for creating so much open space in this plan and chance for us to interact in small groups. So Scherto asked me to begin with a little bit of a personal introduction. And so why am I here? I'll share 4 things. I think first, I'm here because I had the blessing of being born into a family and a faith community that taught me at a very early age that God is love, that we're all children of God, and that we're here most fundamentally to learn how to love. My hope and prayer for all the children of the world is to be given as their birthright that sense of the sacredness of things. Then I'm here because I have 4 and about to be 5 beautiful grandchildren, all under the age of 6. And when I look at them, my heart just goes out with this sense that my generation has made a mess of things. And I want to spend the rest of the time I have trying to do everything I can to create a world in which they and all children and the natural world can flourish. Then I'm here because my professional experience up until about 7 years ago, when I took up this job, was all in the world of Washington politics and advocacy. And I watched that world move further and further out of harmony to the point where I realized there is no political solution, really where I came to the conclusion that the Prime Minister shared with us that all of our ideology has to be working against polarization. As a friend of mine says, we don't need to go left or we don't need to go right, we need to go deeper. And get underneath our political ideologies and find that shared moral vision of a world in which the reality is harmony and flourishing for all people and for the natural world. Finally, I'm here because I feel the pull, the same pull that all of you, I assume, felt, of something larger than ourselves calling us to this work. I guess I'm also here because Fetzer, given our mission and who we are, could not be here. A word about us, the outside world would describe us as a foundation, a very dry term. I like to describe us as an inclusive, spiritually grounded community of love and hope that's working in microcosm on the problem that's facing all of humanity, which is how can we find a shared spiritual place to stand as we try to build a global community, and at the same time recognize and honor that we get to that spiritual common ground on very different paths that shouldn't divide us but should enrich us. So as Pastor Johnson, as you said in that wonderful quote from Paul Tillich, how do we go to the depths of each of our spiritual paths and find the deeper truth that unites us all? So with that as background, so you have a little sense where I'm coming from. First, I'll interject as I left my room on the way over here. I found this door hanger, your standard hotel door hanger. But what does it say? It says, can you believe it? It says, "Feed my soul." This is the branding message from Radisson Hotels. That I think tells you something very deep that really connects with what Nicole was talking about us as a global culture, feeling this sense that it's time to knit that chrysalis in which we all metamorphose together into the next beautiful vision of the human family. And so I take great hope from the fact that that's in our culture, it's in our mass culture in a way that should give us all hope. So we have 3 organizing questions here. How do we understand the connection between harmony and sustaining peace? Got them out of order here. How might harmony inspire transformative practices of global governance? And then what practical steps might global leaders adopt to inspire trust, harmony, and peace? I want to speak briefly to each of those. I'm going to take questions 2 and 3 in reverse order because that's the way I experience the logic of the questions. But harmony, I think of it as bringing discrete forces or persons or communities into right relationship, into loving communion, if you will, into the relationship through which each and all can nurture the flourishing of all. So the relationship between harmony and sustaining peace, I see them as synonyms. That if we can come into right relationship with ourselves, as Sister Gianti said, with spirit, with each other, and with the natural world, we achieve harmony, we achieve sustained peace. And so they're outcomes, I would say, to which we have to work. I think we can all agree we live in a world that is, at least if you read the papers and experience it at the macro level, in great disharmony. So I think we need to understand, first off, what are the deep sources or causes of that disharmony. And I would say, and this is our Fetzer premise, that they go all the way to the ground, the fundamental philosophical ground of how do we try to understand the nature of this reality into which we are all born, this mystery. So the first question is, what are the tools? What are the ways of knowing that we have at our hands to try to understand reality? And that's where I think we face the most fundamental and profound disharmony. If you think of the scientific and rational and spiritual ways of probing the nature of reality, I'd say since the Enlightenment, we in the West and increasingly around the world have been in love with science and rationality. And for good reason, because we have achieved incredible mastery over the material world to the great benefit of humanity. But I think we've failed to recognize the huge price we've paid for this love affair with science and reason, because we have, in the process, I think, lost the confidence of our spiritual intuitions in a way that has caused us to lose our sense of deep meaning, purposefulness, and most fundamentally, just the sacredness of things. And so I think part of what the world is crying out for is reclaiming that spiritual way of knowing. The first question is that really a way of knowing? Because you can look at the great traditions and superficially they tell such different stories. You can say, well, how can I have confidence in any of them? But I think the headline for the 21st century is not those first level differences, but their deep convergence. All of the traditions have probed for millennia the deepest questions of human existence, and I think the headline is none of them have come back from this encounter with the ultimate mystery and said, it's meaningless. Eat, drink, and be merry because there's nothing more than that. Instead, they've all come back in their different ways and said, we live in this deeply interconnected meaningful, purposeful, sacred reality that has a moral core, that has love at its core. And they've all come back in their own ways and said the only appropriate human response is some mix of awe and gratitude and reverence and love. And I talked a minute ago about our effort at Fetzer to find that spiritual common ground for the global community. And I think that's it. That's our shared sacred story. It's this shared affirmation that we do indeed live in a sacred reality, that every human person has an infinite sacred dignity, that the natural world is a sacred gift from Spirit to be nurtured and loved. So I think the most fundamental thing we have to do is bring our ways of knowing back into right relationship, out of which I think emerges this sense of the profound sacredness of everything. So if that's where we start, then this question of what are the practices that leaders can put in place to help work toward this vision of harmony and sustainable peace? And it says global leaders, I should have injected, and I recall that because what I want to say is we need to think differently about who's a global leader. We need to understand that each of us is a global leader. Each of us every day in everything we do creates the global culture. And I think, as it's been lifted up several times already, I think the most profound thing that each of us as global leaders needs to do, first off, is go deep inside and seek that deep harmony with Spirit and with our deeper selves that will allow us to engage each other not from an ego-centered place of separation and fear, but from an all-centered place of wholeness and love. So we're doing a lot of work, very practical in the trenches work, under an initiative we're calling Healing the Heart of American Democracy. And the most profound thing we're trying to do is reframe the conversation to say that it is all about love. That we talk about loving America, and what we say is it's impossible to love America in the abstract. One can only love Americans. And that means all Americans. And so one of the things we're doing is working with one of the big civil society organizations that has a longstanding commitment to leadership development, and with our encouragement and support and collaboration, they're now taking the bold step of saying publicly, there's a new critical dimension to leadership development, and it's that inner spiritual work that will allow us as civil society leaders to engage the world not from that angry advocate's perspective that does more harm than good, but from this place of love and commitment to reconciliation. We're bringing faith leaders together to ask them, why is it that so often you and your communities have shown up as part of the polarizing dynamic in our politics? Surely your deep faith commitments call all of us to be part of the reconciling solution. So I think that's what I'll say about practices. Let's not talk about practices for others. Let's talk about our own internal practice. And then the third question, and I've gotten to the age where I need my glasses. How might harmony inspire transformative practices? No, wait a minute. That's, what practical steps might global leaders adopt? Anyway, you get the drift. I think it is to recognize that we have to connect this inner life, this development of our own capacity for love and compassion, with a fierce determination to transform the systems that are creating the profound disharmonies in the world. if you look out in the world and say what systems are out of alignment with human flourishing in its deepest sense, I think you conclude pretty much all of them, whether it's our educational system or our healthcare system or perhaps most profoundly our economy. We have this economic model that defines human flourishing in this curiously one-dimensional way, that it's all about income and acquisition and consumption, when we all know from our profound lived experience that that's the most superficial level of human flourishing. So how do we move from a world where we measure progress by growth in income and GDP to a world in which we as leaders say we have to have a multidimensional understanding and multidimensional metrics that measure human well-being in its holistic sense? And I know many of you all have already embraced that multiple bottom line idea of flourishing as the basis for your work. So I think I'll just end by saying that I have great optimism, because I think millions of people around the world are being pulled by the same forces that have pulled us here to this realization that something new is wanting to be born, is needing to be born, that can carry us as a human family in that next big step in our spiritual journey. And we just need to find each other and realize that when we connect all the dots, we are the beginning of a powerful global movement that is working on all of the big problems from a deeply spiritually grounded place. As Radisson Hotels remind us, the world is crying out to have us feed our souls, and we can do that, not alone, but together. And as a person of faith, I say, with the understanding that there is something much, much bigger than ourselves that is the wind beneath all of our wings. And so what a wonderful thing. And the last thing I'll say is the most wonderful thing about this work is the people you get to do it with. So again, my gratitude to each of you all, and I hope that before this 3 days is out, I will have a chance to connect with a lot of you just individually. So thank you.
Our gratitude to Bob for such a profound sharing, and I'm sure you're going to prepare some questions for him later. Okay. Ken, would you go on, please?
Yeah, sure. Yes, thank you, Scherto. And I also feel, like Bob, a tremendous gratitude for all of you who've made this event happen, brought the forum into being, and for allowing me to participate and allowing me to relate with you and to take away you with me. So, background relevant to this. Well, unlike Bob, I wasn't born into a harmonious situation in one sense. I was not blessed to have an older brother who was at once a genius and who knew everything and would tell me about it. Now, what this meant was that I was always there with this older brother who knew all the answers to everything and would inform me what I had to do. It was like, and then a father who was a mathematician who also was roughly in the same position. So there wasn't much left for me there, except resistance. And my brother and I resisted each other for a number of years, and I don't remember those early years with great glee. We were always fighting about something, except when a parent would step in. So a mother would say, you go to your rooms, go to your corner, or you won't have this, or you won't have that, or wait till your father comes home. And so we would try to go to our corners and get along with each other. They, the parents, would sustain the peace. And it wasn't really until teen years, in which we were kind of away from parental guidance, that we learned how actually to sustain the peace between us. And it took a lot of learning, how to relate to each other, how to listen in a way that wouldn't register resistance, or which wouldn't lead to an alternative, or in some way fighting against it. We had to learn that. All right, now let me take that story into my first job. I was trained as a PhD psychologist, primarily as a scientist. So we would study issues like aggression, racism, altruism, and so on by observing, arranging situations, looking at cause-effect relationships, writing articles and books, and so on. So I'm at Harvard teaching this, my first job, and I love this stuff because it's optimistic. It says if you only know about these things, look at the changes you can make. You can eliminate racism, eliminate aggression, and so on. It sounded tremendously optimistic through science. Now that was okay, but there was another voice back there that said, a little bit, aren't I like a parent in this? I mean, you have all these things going on that are not harmonious, and I, like my mother or father, are going to know about it and tell you to go to your rooms and don't do that. And here's what you should do. That didn't feel very good. It was like we're providing knowledge about these things, and who is going to use that knowledge but leaders, owners, managers, politicians to make things happen to you? Right, so I'm not real happy with that in my gut. It just didn't feel right. Now there was another thing that happened which is beginning the launch to the next move, which is I was studying foreign aid and conditions under which foreign aid would be helpful to people. And when you get into that and do a lot of interviews about it and look at a lot of data, you realize that foreign aid is different from people who were, in fact, different for a lot of different people. There's some people in the government who look at foreign aid as a humanistic way of relating to the world. Others who look at it as a way of controlling other countries. Others who look at it as a quid pro quo. You give us X politically and we'll give you aid. So what is it? Humanistic? Is it altruism? Is it manipulation? Is it politics? And the same goes on for the people who receive it. Some, oh, I'm really happy to have this, saves my life. Others look at it as an opportunity to take more. Others who look at it as political exploitation. So what is it? Now play with that a little bit, because this begins to have some profound consequences, at least for me and a lot of other people, because if there are multiple perspectives that you can take on which is the perspective of the real? What is it that's happening when those packages go abroad? There are only perspectives on it. There are multiple perspectives. Now, if you push that a bit, it begins to sort of, your sense of reality begins to quake, because you begin to sense that whatever is the case requires a perspective to begin to talk about it, to begin to see it, to begin to value it. Requires some kind of perspective on it. And without that perspective, what is there? Silence. With a perspective, this table becomes alive. This microphone becomes alive as something. I become alive as something. What? A biological being, a spiritual being, part of a culture, a son of a father, what? Multiple perspectives. Now, let me push that another 10 or 15 years further, because it shakes me up, begin to really seriously consider the potential. What is it if we could get together and create perspectives, create visions, create the reality and the meaning of things? We together could do that. Because after all, if that's what we've been doing, and we're divided and inharmonious, then why not create those perspectives which will get us into some further space? This becomes what some people know as social construction, but for a number of us at the time became the beginning of Taos Institute, which was to bring together people from various disciplines and practices who could realize the power of co-creating the realities we live in, co-creating the values, of moving beyond the assumptions that we normally might have. David Cooperrider was one of the founders who was also bringing in the AI perspective. Diana Whitney, who spoke here several years ago, who was also one of the founders. And the point of this Taos Institute was to bring together practitioners and scholars to generate practices of co-creation. Appreciative inquiry was simply one of those practices, which a lot of you know who are here. That is, if you could get together and restory the world, look at it in a different way, look for the positives, inquire into the positives, inquire into what you share, you create a different relationship, and you could create a different way of seeing it, which we could agree upon. So we essentially work with those practices in peace building and education and community building and so on, organizations, healthcare. It's a matter of trying to nurture those practices, share them, educate, and so on. And I can say more about some of that later on, but I'll share that for the discussion. But there's one more piece of this which is important to me and is especially related to the harmony issue. A lot of what we had done in social construction was look at how to create new realities and shared visions, new narratives, new metaphors, that which would bring us together, that which would get us someplace. Less focus on the process of the we doing it. Now, a lot of us in this kind of work use language. For example, appreciative inquiry. We talk to each other. I and you, for example, in a dialogue. But look at this. All the words I'm using are not my words. And they're not yours. They aren't anybody's. All those words came into being only through some kind of coordinated activity, something we do together, not you or me, but that process of the we, the process of coordination. Right? So when I talk, what does it mean? It requires you to do something with it, to bring it into what it is that you want, to bring it into your world in ways that I have no idea. So I'm not making anything happening, I'm just offering, and you're doing something with it. Finding it objectionable, finding it interesting, finding it something there I can use, something I can relate to, something that might raise questions for me, but it requires you, it requires us both to do that. And it's that piece of coordination which becomes fascinating. Because it changes the whole way of understanding what it is we're doing, not you independently, me independently, but what is really happening is that between, is that way in which we're coordinating. So it's in some ways not to ask so much about what's in my head, what is in my feeling, but what is in my head or my feeling, what kind of relationships are they part of? Because they're inside that coordination. So I'm drawn to the practice of coordination. How do we do that? How do I speak in a way that you can take it up, and vice versa? Because you are creating my meaning as I talk, and when you speak next, I'm going to create your meaning. Now, how do we do that in a way which is not divisive? Because we're well trained to argue with each other, to defend our positions, to talk about my feelings and what I want. We're well trained to do that. We're well trained as governments to have arguments, to bargain. It's very difficult to go beyond that and say, how can I build on that? How can we build something together? How can I take the next thing you say and move it somewhere where it wasn't, but it's new and wonderful? Because we all have that potential, but how do we do it? And that becomes a matter of education, for sure. It becomes a matter of the way our organizations work. What kind of relationships do they invite when we work in massive organizations which are controlled from the top down? What kind of education do we have which places everyone in a different box competing with each other? What kind of governments when each government is out for itself, each party is out for itself? What kind of relationship is that? What kind of dialogue? That's what interests me now. And just to relate it back to the issue of harmony, what to me is fascinating about that metaphor is that we know about the notes, but what's being created by those notes together is something which you can't reduce to the notes. It doesn't reduce. You almost can't say what it is. What is that feeling of the harmony? What is that? It's like, so what is it that gives life to us? It's not in the notes. It's in the coordination. Life comes out of the coordination, which we cannot itself examine, penetrate, own with our words. That becomes to me, for me, becomes what I would say is close to spirituality as I feel. That which is beautiful, fantastic, inspiring, which I can't create, you can't create, but is there within the co-creation. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. So we move from music players to music making, moving from dancers to the dance itself. That seems what you're saying. Thank you very much. And Pia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I was thinking a little bit about what I should share with you here today, because obviously I'm here in a panel, a distinguished panel, with these gentlemen and with Scherto as well, and I felt a little bit, to just be honest, overwhelmed. And I thought, how am I going to approach this? How can I say something from my experience that will mean anything to you? But I was very happy to hear that both interventions here are lined up with something that I actually can relate to and tie in with. I'll give you a little bit of a background of what it is that I do and where I come from. My name is not Icelandic, you might have noticed. It's actually Swedish. I was born in Sweden and had a Swedish father, moved to Iceland when I was 10. I worked first years of my career mainly in media, and media can be a very challenging place to work in. After some years working there, I thought that I needed a little bit more on the content side, so I actually decided to add on to my education, and I was quite interested in relationships between states. So that's kind of what I entered into, international relations. I work within the University of Iceland, where I direct an Institute of International Affairs, And as you all know, Icelanders and guests alike, Iceland is a small state. Actually, we could even say a microstate, but I'm not allowed to say that because I think the Icelandic politicians would become extremely upset if I say that. So strike that one. And this means something special, that we are small. And that's why within our institute, that was the kind of a niche we wanted to create. Where can we contribute to IR? Where can we look at something that Iceland can contribute with? And that has to be the position we have as a small state in the world. And I'd say a successful small state, a peaceful small state. But then again, like you heard from our Prime Minister this morning, and certainly it's something that I say wherever I go as well, we are not, although we're at the top of the Global Peace Index, what does that mean? It's a list, it's compiled by something. It's all kinds of data behind it, yes, but nonetheless, don't become too complacent when you're at the top of a list. You know, that's not a good way to present yourself. And it only means that, okay, maybe we're doing better in some areas than others. It doesn't mean peaceful in that sense. Because when we're looking at peace, aren't we always saying absence of war then when we're looking at these lists? Whereas we shouldn't be focusing on that. We should be focusing on positive peace, actually where we feel comfortable in the space that we're in, where we feel content and happy in the space that we're in. So, okay. So that's at least something that we always try to focus on, and that's why we have a Center for Small State Studies, trying to look at the peculiarities maybe, or the strengths that come with being small. We're also, as you know, quite close to the Arctic Circle. We're actually in the Arctic region, and that's another topic that we decided to embrace within our institute. So we have a Center for Arctic Studies as well. Combining these things, though, what we were missing from the puzzle was actually the peaceful part. So in 2016, we decided to go into collaboration with the city of Reykjavík and create HÖFÐI, Reykjavík Peace Center. Now you might ask why HÖFÐI, but probably quite a few of you know that that's the place where Gorbachev and Reagan met in '86. It's a building, quite a nice building. So if you have the opportunity of seeing it while you're here, I encourage you to do so. It didn't mean that they were actually reaching a peace court there. They were having a dialogue. And maybe one could say that that dialogue at some point led to the end of the Cold War. And I think that we can safely say that, actually. So it was an interesting exercise. And it was also a very interesting exercise for a small state like Iceland to be hosting that. To actually say, we can provide a platform. You can come here and talk about your differences in maybe a neutral area, in a sense. And that kind of a position is something that I would hope that Iceland continues to strive for, that we actually can be that kind of a platform where people can come with different opinions on whatever needs to be solved, and we can be that place. And hopefully, that's the Spirit of Humanity Forum has been hosted here 4 times. I think is actually also a very important part of that picture, something that we all should be striving for. On the practical notes of what it is that we do within our Peace Center at the University of Iceland, we started out, like I said, in 2016, so it's been a very short story so far, but hopefully this is only the beginning and will continue to grow. We have a peace conference every year on October 10th that I urge you all to put into your calendar and please come back for. This year we will be focusing on Women for Peace, because if there's something that we can contribute with on the international agenda, Iceland can certainly contribute in the area of equality and remembering to be inclusive. So women at the table is something that's quite important. In any kind of peace and conflict resolution situations, if we do not include women, we're not going to have lasting peace. I mean, I think that is quite something that has been said earlier on today, but certainly needs to be said even louder and more often. So that's something that we're trying to focus on for the conference that we have this year. And What we do at the same time, instead of hosting a conference that maybe leaves some good memories and hopefully we'll be able to pull into a report that people even can look at afterwards, we also wanted to contribute with something, a project that would leave something more sustainable. So what we have is a social innovation accelerator. Now this requires a little bit of explaining, I think. Does anyone know what an accelerator is? A business accelerator? A few, that's good. So what it is basically the opportunity for someone that has a good idea to come into a setting for a few weeks where they actually get support, mentorship and guidance to be able to try to make whatever idea they have sustainable. That it actually can become a company, it can become an association, there are all kinds of possibilities there. But what we're doing is we're offering the opportunity to actually foster that idea and develop it over a period of 8 weeks. So quite soon now we will be advertising for ideas again. We did this the first time last year. We had 7 teams for 7 weeks working on incredible projects. Some of them have come into fruition already. Things like using mushrooms to clean up contaminated earth. This is amazing, isn't it? I thought so, at least. And other things. We have another treatment center that has just been opened for young people that have mental problems. So there are all kinds. The scope is quite wide, but that's how we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be very inclusive for anyone that sits with an idea and doesn't really think that a business accelerator could work. What we then decided to do was to do a social innovation accelerator. So you don't need to think about profit in terms of how much money this can possibly make. We don't care about that. What we do care about, and what weighs even double, is what kind of an effect will this project have? Will it contribute to something good in the community you live in? So that was the idea behind that. We have a few other projects that I think might be interesting to tell you about, but maybe I'll leave it for discussions as well. I can at least mention that we are working a little bit with the Prime Minister's office on this. We're trying to build some capacity for young leaders in Iceland to actually participate in mediation and peace building. So that's something that we're quite happy to hear from a lot of you, because I know there's a lot of experience here in the group, so please reach out to me if you feel that you can share something with me there, because this is of course a learning experience, not just for all of us here, but certainly for some little institute like the one that I have. You know, we need to hear back from the people that actually have been at it for quite a long time. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it for now, but thank you so much for having me here.
How are you feeling up there? Excellent. So we all appreciate the sharing. I want to pick up a couple of things before I hand it over to you. So get your questions warmed up. Okay, so Bob, you were saying that on the one hand, in terms of any global agenda, any agenda like peace and sustaining peace, climate change campaign and so on, you said on the one hand we must start from personal transformation, because that is really the key. But the personal transformation really is the basis for systemic transformation. And Ken, you were talking about, in a sense, that the coordinated movement, we can translate it into dialogue, into curiosity, into mutual questioning, and so on. That is a way to move forward in sustaining that relational processes. And Pia was telling us there are many ways that we need to engage the multi-sectors within the society, and in particular, those kind of involving women in the process, and the kind of qualities that women bring, but it can be brought through by other people, such as men. And so these are the important. Now, I want to put this thing out there. We just had a European EU election, and I think chaos of British politics you've heard from the media. It looks like really the world is heading towards chaos. But following Bob's and Ken's optimism, take a closer look. What we are seeing, just look at the phenomenon of a Europe EU election. Despite seeing there's a tendency far right, and there are lots of concern about the future of Europe, the Europe. But what we see is there's no dominant majority. Do you see? The previous polarizing in the UK sense, the Labour versus Conservative, all we vote is either support this or the other. But that situation's changed. We have lots of smaller parties. Now, the Prime Minister here is a Green Party. There's a Green Party, the Liberal, the Progressive, the Change, and so on and so forth. What is it telling us here? It's telling us something. The world is shifting. The polarization, although it looks like there's lots of divisiveness, there's lots of fragmentation, but something's happening here. I feel it's almost like the time is ripe for jazz, politically, because there are different instruments, different voice, different perspective, different priorities being uttered. What do we do in this case? The Prime Minister said we must have dialogue. And Professor Gergen said that we must have coordination, coordinated action. And Bob said we must go beyond all this and reach human spirit. So now just put this out there on the table. Any comments, any feedback would be good. And also for the audience to consider that. Please.
I'll just be very brazen. I thought what you were talking about, of course, is what we're all feeling, that we are part of bubbles, right? We're all in certain bubbles. Like, I work in academia, I work within the University of Iceland, and I talk to people that are like-minded practically every day. And I think that the vision I then get of life is the correct one, except it's not, really. I mean, this is like the Facebook problem, isn't it? So what we need to do is, I think, to puncture those bubbles. And anytime you get kind of a project where you can lean into another discipline, go across a border, that really is the way to go. And I have some hope, although it's not looking very good for the climate. But because it's such a global crisis, it's of that kind of a measure that our life on planet is threatened. And then when it becomes that kind of a global problem, I think that the bubbles will burst. They will have to, because we're not going to be able to tackle this within one bubble. It has to be unified. And this is where we should be looking at the young generation. I mean, what an inspiration. Look at Greta Thunberg, look at these people. They are just wonderful. And that's kind of where it lies, doesn't it? That's the possibility, I think. But it's a serious situation.
The challenge is how to break the bubbles, because they're always in motion. And one could look at the proliferation of political parties here in Europe as being a good thing, because you have more voices being manifest. On the other hand, you could look at it as a multiplication of the bubbles, because as long as democracy works on a party system, with each party attempting to enforce itself, where is the common good? I mean, is the common good simply a result of counting all the voices and the majority wins? Is that the common good? It's just the majority? There's no real dialogue there among parties if each party is out for itself. So the question is, how do you do the bubbles? Now, what I've been trying to do and working with, and particularly interested me, is collaborative governance. That is trying at local levels to break down the difference between the politics, i.e. my parents telling us what the policies are, and people we, in quote, serve. I'll give you just one example. This is a group in part of our dialogues in Denmark. And there it's looked at as relational welfare, because they have a welfare state in a sense that provides everything for everyone based on tax money. Well, when a person goes in need, let's say is jobless, they go into an office where everything is, traditionally, where everything is laid down. All the policies are there in place, and you get so much money to do this, and you have to go to X number of places and apply for jobs. It's all laid down for you. What they're trying to do is to break that down at a municipal level so that that's a dialogue. You don't set those policies up in advance. You listen to each individual in their particular context and how it would work out for them given the resources that you can provide. Now, this is just one example where you try to break the bubbles by working with the people between government and populace. And there are I'll give you one more, but I don't want to take the podium any further. Bob, I'm sure you've got something to add to this.
Well, I'll try. First off, just to express agreement with what both of you all have said. I think the presenting challenge is we have done such a good job in sorting ourselves out so that we interact with people like us. So how do we break out of that? But before I share a couple of thoughts on that, I'll say we step back and think about this overall problem of polarization, which we've done a lot in the U.S. context. I will say the most in-depth analyses of public opinion where the citizenry are in the U.S. Makes pretty clear that the polarizing energy is overwhelmingly coming from actually quite small groups on either end of the spectrum, and that there's in the middle, 80%, say, a sense of great frustration and growing disengagement because they don't see, we don't see, the uniting voice, the uniting vision. There's a wonderful Old Testament statement, I think, from Isaiah, without a vision, the people perish. But this, and one recent report calls it the exhausted majority. When you ask them, are you open to compromise? Yes. Do you want to come together? Yes. But I think one of the big things, and just to add something different from what you all have already suggested, is the need for bold leaders to step into this conversation about our common life and say, we can find a deeper, morally, spiritually grounded vision of the kind of society we want to create based on a shared commitment to human flourishing. And that can provide the frame within which our ideological differences can become a virtuous competition. If we come to this effort to create this society in which all can flourish with some appropriate sense of humility, that our life experience is just our life experience, it's led us to some ideas about how to structure society, but it's based on a very limited experience base. So we have to be open to learning from each other. Then big government, small government, let's experiment in different contexts about which works better. So I'm actually quite encouraged because what we're finding is that on both sides, individuals and groups that have been committed for decades to hyper-partisanship are now realizing that their work is ripping our country apart. And so I'm finding leaders with that profile on both left and right now saying, I can't do that any longer. One of them, groups we're talking about, very powerful group on the right in American politics, has said, we're now about courageous collaborations with groups on the left. One recent example, major reform of our criminal justice system, based on a shared commitment that we have to be committed to rehabilitation rather than a punitive approach. So, I think we have to wrestle with it at this level. How do we break out of our bubbles? How do we listen to each other from a place of real openness and humility? And how do we find that shared moral vision that can bring us together?
Thank you. I'm just going to follow up with another question before I hand it over to you. There are lots of young people here, and this morning the choir, young people in the choir, they touched us deeply. So with them, with those young people in mind, and what we have elders of the community here, the three of you, with this kind of global vision, the coordination, the listening, the collaboration, and so on, we tend to say, well, that's at the systemic level, we need to bring the leaders to do that. And the fact is that lots of political leaders can only speak for and on behalf of their party, that's another matter, put it aside. But they are our future. How do we engage them? How do we engage them so that what we're talking about here matters to them? These things are relevant to them, so that they not feel that they're cast away. How do we engage them? How do we encourage the curiosity from young people from the beginning, so that living in Iceland, they would be concerned with what's happening with Maoris in New Zealand, or from young people in the UK were really concerned about the Rohingya kids' life. So how do we make what we're talking about, the global issues, sustaining peace, very much relevant to children and young people of today?
I'd say the first thing we do is we love them. And I think that's true even profoundly at the neurological level. We now know that whether or not a child receives loving nurture in early years actually affects the wiring of the brain in ways that have lifelong effects on their ability to form pro-social attachments. And to put it in a sound bite, hurt people, and whole people, healthy people. What hurt people? I can't remember how that goes. But there's a wonderful sound bite that completes the thought that our capacity to love, I think, is in direct proportion to the love we have received in our lives. So, too many of children in our country grow up in situations where their worth is just not affirmed in concrete ways. And so I think we have to start at that very early level and create a society in which they feel affirmed and important and loved.
Thank you.
I can maybe add a little bit onto that as well, because I think that this is, of course, a question also of the educational system and how we want to be, realize how we need to develop that for the challenges presented to us today. And I think that we need to kind of throw out the textbooks a little bit on that, and certainly burst out of the bubble and think outside the box and whatever else inspirational kind of quotes we can think of. But it really needs to go down to the level of talking not to children, but with them and listening to them and being certain that we also learn from them, because they are extremely well equipped to deal with issues of expressing their emotions and being creative. And so we have to be very careful about how we develop our educational system, because this is something that I feel in many places, and I'm not going to be pointing any fingers there because we're certainly seeing a lot of good things happening as well, but this is somewhere where we really need to be focused, because it doesn't matter what you learn in school. It's more about, do you learn to become a good citizen? Do you learn to feel empathy for what's going on? Can you continue learning? It's not about whether you know your ABCs. It really isn't. So it has to be on that emotional level that we kind of start looking into how we're going to be teaching our children for the future.
Let me pick up the education level, because that interests me a great deal. Even if I can be loved, I go into a system at the age of 6 for 12 years, in which that's not the name of the game, in which every day the system is laid there for me, and I'm to take that in, and the rules are all set up where I'm competing with everybody in that classroom. I'm not particularly engaged, it's not what I'm interested in. It's not a training in being interested, it's a training in being dulled. When everything is set up in advance, I'm not part of the dialogue. I am simply told to be silent and master what is being told, and then to compete with everybody for that. So what capacities do I have to engage in a discussion of the vision? Where are my resources? Nobody asked me that before. Should I have a vision? Nobody asked me in that system what I really care about, or what is really moral, or to work through those moral problems. Public education is by and large demoralized and depoliticized because teachers are afraid to get engaged in that because they'll gain part of the controversies. So in some way, what I'm really fascinated by is the ways in which we can, locally, nationally, change that educational system. And I think it's already in motion. I think this whole movement towards individualized or group work or project-based learning, moving with, being part of the world, it's changing. To get rid of grades as being the answer to that whole competition, to find some alternative to that, that's happening. Those are the kinds of things that are really worth pushing, and if we could do that, I mean, then we would have more young people standing up politically and saying to the world, hey, you got to do something about the environment. That's heartening to me.
Yeah. I just want to follow up on what you're talking about, just to maybe clarify a little bit or broaden what I'm suggesting when I say we need to love our children. I see love as an organizing principle, not just for individual relationships, but for our collective, our common life. And so I think of loving children individually, certainly within our families and communities, but I think we choose to love them or not collectively through the systems that we create to nurture their well-being. So as you're saying, I think certainly in our country, the educational momentum over the last 20 years has been very much toward education for work, for technical competence, for technical knowledge, which I think within my lens is a very unloving way to treat our children, because if love at its deepest level is a commitment to the flourishing of the other, we need to design an educational system based on a holistic understanding of human flourishing, a recognition that at the end of the day, the social and emotional, and I would say spiritual development has a more profound long-term effect on whether that child flourishes than the information that they learn. So I just encourage us, comment was made earlier that we tend not to introduce the concept of love into serious discussions about social systems. But I would submit that it's the only concept that's deep enough and most powerful enough to compel us to redesign systems in ways that promote holistic human flourishing.
Thank you. Are you still with us? Great. So it's over to you now. Yes, we're going to see a show of hands. So may I ask you, just very briefly, say your name and your question, and to whom the question is directed to. Yeah? Okay, very briefly. Each question, please, if it's a comment, please make it brief. If it's a question, make it clear and tell us to whom it is directed. I saw one hand there, and one hand there. So one in the north, one is south, is it? Ota? That's the north, that's the south, and there's one middle. Okay, so we start from the north side. Please, pass the microphone. Thank you.
My name is Yosune Moneo. I come from Spain, and I work as consultant and researcher for sustainable development. And I came here with a message from my niece. She was painting a stone. On the stone was written, small is very big. Small is really big. And I think we are like a puzzle of memories of the history, of the natural history, not the human history, the natural history. And each identity has a value. And that's why I'm here, because I think that Iceland might be the perfect lab of human sustainable development, because you are in Iceland, because you are small enough to keep having human dialogue, which is very difficult in big countries, really. In my country, we are 47 million people. I'm Spanish. We have a lot of divisions, a lot of provinces, a lot of cities, different interests for different regions, diversity, diverse problems, diverse landscapes. It's very difficult to come into dialogue. And I think you are making a big difference already, having dialogue in mind at all. So I really appreciate what you are bringing for the world, and I hope I can really work in collaboration with what you are doing. Thank you.
All right, I'm Peter Hesse from Germany, but mainly working in Haiti and Africa for children. And I want to jump in just very shortly on what was discussed here in this group and confirm this and bring in a concrete experience from this field. I call it love in action with children, and it works. That if we take into consideration that about 100 years ago already, someone, Maria Montessori, has discovered how children really like to learn, but now brain research has confirmed this, except that none of those researchers have the courage yet to really refer to Maria Montessori 100 years ago. Well, I don't say that they should go into conflict, but harmony between the researchers and these old Montessori ideas would be a concrete thing to be furthered, and it would work exactly in the framework of what you're just asking. The educational situation, especially for the kids, but also primary and further education in the world is desperate. It is not so good in our countries, it's not very good in Germany either, and so on, but it's desperately bad in the developing world. And it needs, for a better future and harmony and sustaining peace, to be improved, and it could be improved if you bring harmony between the researchers and the traditional knowledge which is already there. I'm working with Montessori since over 30 years in Haiti, and this is a terrible country. And even there, you can bring, we have trained over 1,000 teachers in Montessori preschool, and it does work. In the cheapest situation, most primitive civilization, with relatively limited funds, you can teach something which works for children and give children a chance. in the way which modern science, I repeat this, I have to repeat this because it's so important. Modern science has confirmed. It is confirmed that children learn in their own motivation. And it has to be made possible. Maria Montessori said so, but new techniques just claim so, but it's not being put into realization. That would be one very important field we could go on. I have another point, but I won't touch it. Just mention the next point I would like to, but I don't do it now, don't worry, is how do we reach the heart of politics? Without reaching the heart of politics and their interests, the politics won't change. But that is another point for another discussion, maybe another day.
Peter, thank you very much. I think what you're saying is you're ready, and I think the audience, all the participants here, are ready to enter into that dialogue group. You are ready to share.
So, my name is Gill, and I have a question. The question is directed to you, Bob, but I would love Pia and Professor to actually collaborate on it. The question is that, Bob, you said that we need to start with ourselves, that it starts there. So how can the infrastructure of the government, of the nation, help individuals to help themselves? How can we create a structure so that people can get a guidance in the direction of helping themselves with whatever problem that they need to work on so they can grow as individuals?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, 2 comments and 1 question. Thank you very much for that question. Maybe we could just talk it together. So one is, small is big. In a sense, today there's lots of reflection on what small countries like Iceland, New Zealand, and Bhutan can do, and what they can model that can help and inspire us. And the second is love in action through education and through other kind of field work. And the third one is really a question. This is, how does the system transformation actually it can foster and cultivate this individual transformation? Should we just have a little chat about it together?
Well, I'll start responding to the question. First off, I think it's a critical question because I think we need to think about creating the ecology that supports holistic human development, inner spiritual development. And it's, I think it requires a multifaceted response. We've talked about the critical importance of education, and of course that's largely in the public sector, not exclusively, and very important. But I think we also need to recognize the other dimensions of our life and social systems that connect with this challenge of nurturing holistic development. When I reflect on that, I always start with the observation that, in my experience, the family is the most profound place, or where our values are shaped most profoundly. So to the extent our social policies can nurture strong families, I think that would be a priority for me. I think faith communities have a critical role to play, greater in some cultures and societies than in others. And we're focused on the challenge of providing both place-based and web-based resources to support individual spiritual exploration and practice. And I think that's one place where we now, through the web, literally have the capacity to draw on the spiritual riches of all of the traditions. There are lots of places you can go to find support for meditation, for other forms of spiritual practice, but also the importance of places, of retreat centers, of opportunities to go into nature. And one thing I'll just lift up, one among us, Tomas Bjorkman, can't see you, Tomas, has a wonderful book appropriately for our setting called The Nordic Secret that focuses on the history in Scandinavia. Very good. In the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, where there was actually a very intentional, large-scale governmental effort to support the creation of both community-based programs and networks of retreat centers operated by a diverse range of organizations, both faith-based and non-faith-based, to support intensively support the inner development of individuals, and with great positive impact. So it stands for the proposition that at the societal level, we are capable of taking this on in a very intentional way.
Yes, thank you so much for the comment on the small being nice or big. I also wanted to reflect a little bit back on, though, because we talk about this like the dialogue in Iceland should be easier because it's a small state. I think that what makes it difficult in Iceland, nonetheless, is that politics here have been highly confrontational, and it's still very much at that. You know, so we should also tell the stories, the truthful stories. You know, although we're trying to make a very good position for ourselves as being very small and very peaceful and cute and all that. You know, we have all kinds of things that we need to deal with here, and politics is not at a good place. Let's put it that way. And I think that in many ways, politicians in Iceland should probably learn from some of their Nordic colleagues, for example, on how you try to get together to reach a common goal. But this is really a learning experience for the politicians to try to tackle here, and I think that we as a society should try to foster that, because we are certainly not going to go anywhere in trying to solve the political issues in Iceland the way the atmosphere is in politics now. But it makes it easier that we're smaller, and that's why we should really not give up on the possibility. But thank you for the comment.
Continue. There's so much on the table here, a couple of things. One is, I mean, democracy is supposed to have brought us into a new era where all voices speak, and that was perhaps a good move. But so long as democracy is based on individuals, on units, each with their own view, with their own profession, trying to work for themselves for the better of their vision, we're in combat. I mean, democracy is set up to do that. So dialogue becomes war by other means. It's a matter of who can influence whom. So there's some way in which, I mean, to me, a big challenge is how to rethink democracy in a way in which whatever we're going to call dialogue and how it works is refigured, so that issues don't boil down to for and against two parties, because issues none of the issues that we face are that simple of having two sides. They're called nasty problems, where everything you do, everything you eat is already a world issue. Where did it come from? What did it cost? Whose job was that? What was the carbon footprint? There are no more simple problems, and the notion that we can simply add up voices or have two parties that work it out, those days are finished. Now let me go to another level. It seems to me that most of our institutions, like particularly in the business world, but also in the nonprofit, are based on a common vision and then trying to secure that vision with rules, policies, and so on. So everybody is on board, it works efficiently, everybody knows what to do, and so on. School systems are like that, businesses are like that, policies are demanded, and the policies are changed usually from the top down. Now that's all right as long as you've got everybody on board and the world stays the same. And you can develop a good policy today, and so long as the environment stays stable, hey, yeah, that's a good thing. And the knowledge that you have, for example, in education, as long as that's the knowledge that you need tomorrow, fine. But what's happened with the sort of, particularly technologies, the movement of the world, the global movement, is incredibly fast. So any policy, any organization which is based on some vision which is now, is already undermined. It's already being questioned by, or there are forces in the world which will work toward decay. So you got this sort of massive ordering attempt to make sure it works the way we think, and then a continuous disordering effect. Now, there's a way in which that disorder may work towards the kinds of things that we're talking about. If we could learn how to work with multiple perspectives, multiple visions, how to relate with that, how to work toward a vision which may never be realized but is always under process with us. How do we get to that? That to me is the real challenge.
Can I just pick up on that? Because I think, I got it. Sorry. Yeah, I think you framed the challenge beautifully, that we live in this world of extreme complexity, which I think brings extreme fragility, actually. It's very scary. And that is moving at an accelerating rate, not just at the first level, but the rate of acceleration is accelerating. So the idea of creating a structure and then expecting it to last over time is just a relic. So we need systems that are highly decentralized, very adaptive. And when I go down that line of thought, it leads me to the conclusion that the only adequate response is to recognize that each of us is a decision maker, continually making decisions that affect the evolution of the collective reality and of these systems. And only if a critical mass of us as individual decision makers move to a higher level, we'll say higher level of consciousness, or a deeper level of virtue, so that our automatic response when confronted with a decision is to make an all-centered response rather than an ego-centered response. It seems to me that's the only way that this complex, rapidly evolving system has any chance of being resilient and of working for the greater good.
Scherto, it's over here. There are a few more questions in the audience.
Yes.
Do you have time?
We have, we'd definitely like to listen to your question, but whether there is enough time, because we have these excellent speakers, what they do is they take your question and run with it and expand it. So we will listen to you. Is that okay? And I can't promise we have time for everybody to give you a full response. Is that fair? Starting point. Thank you very much. So please, I will take three questions, one in the north, one in the south, and one in the middle. Where the microphone goes, I don't mind, just take it.
This is my I'm Fabiana Crespo from Argentina. I'm an investigative journalist. I research about science and spirituality. And especially to Bob, but for everyone, don't you think that these matters can be solved if you first know how to love yourself and then project outside what you grow out inside?
Thank you.
Quick answer, yes.
I knew that. The middle. Someone from the middle, please.
Hi, my name is Elin. One question that I just formed when you were in the discussion. We have all these ideas, these visions for a better world, but we struggle as advocates to get funding. And my question is, like, how can we, as organizations, nonprofits, advocates, whatever, get the funding we need, get the governments to fund what we are fighting for? Because that has always been a problem. It's always been a resistance against that.
Thank you. Is there anyone here? There are two hands, one in the front, one in the back. Can we just listen to both, please?
Hello, I am Sarah from the Philippines, and I've been involved in the peace process in the Philippines and worked with displacement and conflict, and we use whole systems thinking and design. Some of us here in this part of the room are curious about how we can make visible what is already being done here, because there's so many amazing initiatives, and we speak about networks and systems and appreciative inquiry and the chrysalis. And the chrysalis meaning is the dying, and in that dying of the caterpillar is the emergence of imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells, when they multiply, they start taking over the old system. And I'm curious how, because this forum, when it ends, where does it go, and where that collective vision goes together. And so we're just going to park that here. And I believe platforms like this has a very beautiful opportunity to make visible the invisible. And there's, just listening to everyone here, there's so much collective wisdom already, and hopefully we can harvest that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And there's one in front. We want to listen at least.
Hi, my name is Deepa Patel, and I wanted to come back to your mentioning of jazz, because as you were talking, I was thinking about Miles Davis. And there's two quotes from Miles Davis. The first one is, sometimes you have to play a long time to be able to play like yourself. And the other is, anybody can play, the note is 20%. The attitude of the person playing it is 80%. And so my question actually has to do with where we're going to be flipping from these micro questions to us as individuals, as leaders. And so my question to the three of you was, what, as leaders right now, what is the change in attitude that you could make that would help you to play more like yourselves?
Thank you. Well, powerful questions. I'm glad that we have the opportunity to listen to you. It'd be good to listen more, and that is why we have the dialogue group. Go there and share your perspectives, listen to others. Now we answer that question, love yourself, yes. That's a resounding yes. Now there are two challenges, which is, one is about funding, the other one is how to make the stories heard or visible. And then it's how do we really, how do we jazz more beautifully? And so, would you just each take all of this together and have your final thoughts? Lots of it, I know. Please.
Thank you so much for all your lovely comments and for participating in this dialogue. Yes. On what level? How can I actually make this work then in the work that I have ahead of me? I think that on a personal level, it's something about slowing down at the same time as you're speeding up and actually realizing all the opportunities that lie out there, but also being in the moment and realizing what are the best opportunities to grab for the work that we're doing. On a personal level, I'm going to be grandmother this fall, so that will be, I'm sure, the best spiritual experience for me. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ken? Well, the question is basically, what do we do? Where do we start? How do we boost our 80% when we jazz as an individual or as a leader? But also, there's a question about funding, about visibility.
there's several levels that I feel sort of answers coming up. One is a bit like Bob's, and that is the next moment, the next conversation, the next relationship. We're already in it. This is not a matter of always of policies and planning and so on. But we're already into the process. And whatever we take away from here, in the next conversation, in the next place that we are, we will take this conversation in part with us. Some of this will carry on. So in some sense, we're doing culture change, we're doing global change, we're doing spiritual change in the very process of what we're doing. And how we look at each other in the eyes, whether we honor their way they speak, all of that has the potential to carry on. Now, just personally, I spend a lot of time writing and hope that continues and continues to carry out. And I work with this institute and people I work with, helping that all to take place so that it becomes a sort of a global sharing of practices and possibilities that are more like what we're talking about in terms of co-creation, in terms of listening and being together, or you might say, in terms of harmonizing. I don't know, I wish I could slow down. But, I mean, that's a wonderful advice. Somehow the way in which the world is sped up and every voice becomes multiplied by 10 voices, and the email that happened yesterday is somewhere in the past in 2 days, and the news cycle every day is a new catastrophe in somewhere. It's like really hard to slow down, but I would love that idea. I love the idea.
Yeah, a great question. And I appreciate you aiming it right at us in terms of what we could do as individuals to play more like ourselves. And my thoughts go in a couple of, maybe 3 different directions. One is just to continue, you know, I feel like I have a responsibility to continually grapple with the extent to which I and the way I engage the world have been shaped by the old system and the old way of being. And the extent to which often unconsciously I've bought in to a set of values that if I step back are really antithetical to the vision that we're talking about. So, and that's hard because it's demanding. But at the other end, I feel like I got to figure out how to do that while simultaneously, you know, embracing all that I do have to offer to the creation of this new vision, and to have the courage to step into this moment, mindful of how imperfect I am, so with a great deal of humility, but also with the courage to take a bold stand for this new vision.
Thank you. Well, so far we heard that peace and harmony really plays on the alchemy of human relationship, and the right relationship will emerge from that, because it's only these relationships that turn human sufferings and vulnerability into community, tensions, conflict, into some kind of a creative energy. And in dialogue, we could move towards that vision of the flourishing, flourishing of all. So with that, and there will be a lot more, let's first thank our panelists for their excellent contribution. And on behalf of our panelists and the forum, I thank you for your listening, presence, and care. Thank you.